There's a brutal difference between being isolated against your will and choosing to isolate yourself consciously. Science is discovering that these are completely different neurological processes. One destroys you. The other can transform you in ways you never imagined. And Jung mapped this out a century ago, without a single brain scan. In June of 2024, researchers published a study analyzing what happens in the medial prefrontal cortex of adults after just 10 days of voluntary isolation. They measured gene expression using RNA sequencing and found that 46 genes changed their expression. 46 genes, in just 10 days. Your brain literally rewrites your genetic programming when you withdraw from the world by choice. But here's what nobody tells you. These changes aren't random. They follow a specific pattern, a pattern that Jung described in psychological language decades before neuroscience even existed. And when you understand this pattern, you can use isolation as a tool for transformation. Instead of letting it destroy you, hold on to that, because what's coming next could completely change how you view your periods of solitude. Jung said something that seems like a contradiction, but that science now confirms to be neurologically true. He said that solitude isn't merely an absence of others. It's an active state, an opportunity to turn inward. When the noise of society, the expectations of others, and the constant flood of external stimuli disappear, a different space opens up. That different space has a name in neuroscience. It's called a heightened state of neuroplasticity. Andrew Huberman explains that neuroplasticity is controlled by neuromodulators like dopamine, serotonin, and acetylcholine. These neurochemicals open windows of plasticity and allow for brief periods of time where information can be mapped into the brain in permanent ways. And here's the crucial discovery. During voluntary isolation, you enter a heightened state of neuroplasticity. This means that your brain is more open to change than normal. Not just a little more open, significantly more open. Every insight you have, every pattern you notice, every truth you confront, all of this can solidify much more deeply than would be possible in the middle of daily social chaos. But hold on, because there's a detail that changes everything. Huberman has identified that the entry point for neuroplasticity is agitation and tension, not comfort, not passive relaxation. Agitation and tension. This means that if you're isolating yourself to escape discomfort, you're wasting the opportunity. Isolation only activates transformative plasticity when you use that space to confront what you normally avoid. And this is exactly where Jung was decades ahead. He said that when the demand for individuation appears, it means goodbye to personal conformity with the collective and entering solitude, into the inner sanctum of self. He was describing what happens neurologically when you withdraw to confront yourself. The inner sanctum of self is the space where the shadow self becomes visible. Jung discovered that in moments of solitude, when the usual social masks are down, the shadow self tends to become more visible. You start to notice attitudes or feelings in yourself that you don't like or find embarrassing. Confronting the shadow self requires courage. This isn't metaphor. It's neurobiology. Your brain's default mode network, which processes self-reflection and personal narrative, operates differently when you're isolated. Without the constant social stimuli, without the need to keep the persona activated, this network can finally process material that's normally suppressed. Researchers have discovered that the neural fingerprints of solitude can be observed in the intrinsic architecture of the human brain. Connectivity within and between networks, specifically those involving prefrontal, limbic, and temporal systems, predicts solitude. These connections are crucial for cognitive control, emotional processing, and social perception. In other words, when you isolate yourself, the way different parts of your brain communicate with each other changes. And that change can be for better or worse, depending on what you do with the space that isolation creates. Let me show you exactly what happens day after day when you isolate yourself by choice. The first 3 days are the hardest. Your brain is accustomed to a constant flow of social stimuli, social media, conversations, interactions, glances, validation. When all of that disappears, your nervous system interprets it as an alarm signal. The dopamine you normally get from social interactions decreases. You may feel restlessness, anxiety, an intense urge to pick up your phone and check messages. This isn't weakness, it's social withdrawal. Your brain is calibrated to a level of stimulus that suddenly isn't available anymore. And this withdrawal, although uncomfortable, is exactly what opens the door to transformation. Huberman explains that urgency and focus are what promote the neurochemicals that trigger neural plasticity. The most powerful brain changes happen when you focus, have an internal sense of urgency, and get enough sleep. During these first days of discomfort, you're experiencing exactly that urgency. Your system is in a state of alert, and it's that state of alert that opens plasticity. Here's the mistake most people make. They interpret the discomfort as a sign that they should go back. They think they're doing something wrong. In reality, the discomfort is a sign that the process is working. It's the tension that Huberman identifies as the entry point for neural change. Jung knew this intuitively. He described his own period of isolation after breaking with Freud. The consequence of my resolution to follow the inner images and my involvement with things which neither I nor anyone could understand was an extreme loneliness. He didn't run from that extreme loneliness. He remained in it. And it was exactly that which allowed the transformation. From day 4 to day 10, something starts to change. The initial discomfort starts to give way to something different. Your brain is adapting to the new baseline. The 2024 study showed that in this period, the 46 genes in the medial prefrontal cortex have already altered their expression. You're no longer the same neurological person you were when you started. The researchers observed that the isolated animals exhibited reduced sociability and reduced preference for social novelty, but increased social interaction when it occurred without change in aggression, anxiety, or depressive activity. This is fascinating. Isolation didn't turn those animals antisocial. It changed the quality of how they related, translating that to the human experience. After a week of voluntary isolation, you might find that you want less interaction, but the interactions you do have become more intense, more present, more meaningful. The quantity decreases. The quality increases. Jung described this as the process of individuation. You're differentiating yourself from the collective mass, not because you're becoming superior, but because you're becoming more yourself. And the more you become yourself, the less you need constant external validation to know who you are. Jung mapped out 4 alchemical phases that happen during psychological transformation, and each of these phases has specific neurological correlates that modern science is just beginning to identify. The first phase is nigredo, the darkening. It's when the ego begins to die. In neurological terms, this corresponds to the initial period of social withdrawal, where dopamine reward circuits are recalibrating. You feel darkness because the usual sources of pleasure are no longer available. This isn't the end, it's the necessary beginning. The second phase is albedo, the whitening. It's the withdrawal from the world for intense reflection. Neurologically, this corresponds to the period where the default mode network can operate without constant social interference. Self-reflection deepens. Unconscious material begins to emerge. It's in this phase that most people find themselves when they consciously choose to isolate. The third phase is citrinitas, the yellowing. It's when higher consciousness begins to emerge. Neurologically, this corresponds to the phase where new patterns of connectivity between brain networks are forming. Insights begin to consolidate. Clarity increases. The fourth phase is rubedo, the reddening. It's the union of opposites and complete rebirth. Neurologically, this corresponds to the successful integration of new patterns that are now stable and permanent. The transformation is complete. The problem is, most people get stuck in either the nigredo or albedo phase. They experience the initial darkening or the intense reflection. But they don't know how to progress to the following phases. And without progression, isolation becomes stagnation instead of transformation. From the second to the fourth week, the changes deepen significantly. Neuroimaging research shows that isolation during this period starts to affect the white matter density in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. White matter is the wiring of your brain. It's what connects different regions. Changes here mean that the way your brain processes information is reorganizing at a deeply structural level. This can go in two completely different directions, depending on what you do during the isolation. If you're using the isolation for passive rumination, to just keep thinking the same thoughts repeatedly, to sink into narratives of victimization or superiority, the reorganization will strengthen those destructive patterns. You're essentially training your brain to get stuck in negative loops, deeper and deeper. But if you're using the isolation for what Jung called active confrontation with the unconscious, the reorganization will strengthen new constructive patterns. You're training your brain to integrate material that was previously separate from consciousness and to process emotions that were previously repressed. The difference is in what you do with the silence, and that difference has measurable neurological consequences. Jung developed specific techniques for using isolation productively. He called it active imagination. It's the process of consciously engaging with images and content that arise from the unconscious, not to suppress them, not to get lost in them, but to dialogue with them in a conscious and directed way. Modern neuroscience shows that this type of conscious engagement with unconscious material activates both the default mode network and the executive control network simultaneously. Normally, these networks work in an alternating way, one active while the other is less active. During active imagination, they work together in a coordinated way. This creates a unique state of processing that allows integration of material that would normally remain fragmented and inaccessible. And here's what happens when you push past the first month. A 2025 study published in Nature Communications examined the effects of social isolation during early development in mice. They found that isolation leads to reduced segregation of brain networks, notably affecting the olfactory and visual networks. In humans, analogous effects have been observed in the prefrontal, limbic, and temporal systems. Segregation of networks is how your brain keeps different functions separate and organized. When that segregation decreases, the boundaries between different mental processes become more permeable. This can be chaotic disorganization, or it can be creative integration, depending on how you navigate the process. Jung described exactly this more than a century ago. He said that during intense phases of confrontation with the unconscious, the boundaries between conscious and unconscious become more permeable. Content that would normally remain separate begins to communicate. This can feel like total chaos, or it can feel like profound revelation, depending on how you sustain the process and how much structure you have to process what emerges. Researchers also found structural changes in two brain regions critical for normal social interactions and emotional control: the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. To a lesser extent, changes were observed in the hippocampus, which is crucial for memory and contextual processing. The total volume of the amygdala was consistently higher in response to social isolation. The amygdala is your emotional processing center. An increase in its volume can mean that you are processing more emotional material than you normally would in normal social circumstances. This corresponds exactly to what Jung was describing. When you withdraw from the world, emotions that are normally suppressed by constant activity and social demands start to emerge with force. This is not a problem. It's the point. The question is whether you have the structure to process this material, or whether it's going to overwhelm you and cause collapse instead of integration. Jung was very clear about this. He said that confronting the shadow self is essential to achieving psychological wholeness. Suppressing the shadow self leads to internal conflict and increasing imbalance over time. In contrast, recognizing and integrating these hidden aspects leads to greater self-acceptance. It frees up energy that was being used for repression and unlocks hidden strengths that can be used constructively. The key is in conscious recognition and integration, not passive submersion or active suppression. If you're in isolation, and difficult emotional material is surfacing. That's a sign the process is working correctly. Your brain is using the space to process what it can't process in the midst of constant social life. The question isn't to avoid that material or run from it. The question is, how do you consciously relate to it? Jung developed what he called maintaining the tension of opposites. When contradictory material arises, you don't choose a side immediately. You don't suppress what you don't like and amplify what you do like. You hold both consciously. You maintain the tension without resolving it prematurely, and from that sustained tension, something new can emerge, something that transcends both original opposites. Neuroscience now shows that this process of maintaining tension corresponds to simultaneous activation of circuits that normally inhibit each other. It's neurologically uncomfortable because it goes against the brain's usual pattern of resolving tension quickly. But it's exactly this sustained discomfort that allows for new syntheses and integrations. That wouldn't be possible otherwise. Here's what happens when isolation extends beyond the recommended period, without the proper practices. Studies show that prolonged chronic isolation can cause actual deterioration in essential circuits. Lower white matter density in the dorsolateral medial prefrontal cortex is strongly associated with increasing emotional dysregulation. Altered connectivity between prefrontal, limbic, and temporal systems can progressively hinder cognitive control and healthy emotional processing. Jung warned about this using completely different language, but describing the same phenomenon. He said that you can never truly find yourself by building a meditation hut on top of Mount Everest. You'll only be visited by your own shadow self. And that isn't individuation. It's escape disguised as spirituality. Isolation is a tool. Tools have appropriate uses and limits of application. You don't use a hammer to tighten screws. You don't use isolation as a permanent lifestyle when the stated goal is transformation. Transformation requires eventually returning and integrating what was discovered. The albedo phase that Jung described, the withdrawal from the world for intense reflection, is exactly that, a transitory phase, not a permanent destination. It's followed by other phases, citrinitas and rubedo, which require a return to the world and practical integration of what was discovered during withdrawal. So, what's the ideal duration for transformative voluntary isolation? Science suggests the benefits of voluntary isolation are maximized in periods ranging from 1 to 4 weeks for most people. Less than that might not be enough for neurological changes to consolidate properly. More than that starts to bring the risks of potentially problematic structural alterations if there aren't adequate supporting practices. But the duration is less important than the quality of what you do during the isolation. Jung spent 6 years in his most intense period of confronting the unconscious. But he wasn't passively isolated doing nothing. He was actively engaged in specific processes every day. He documented dreams meticulously, practiced active imagination regularly, painted mandalas as a way to give visual form to what emerged, carved in stone to process material through the body. Each activity was part of a deliberate and structured process of dialoguing with the unconscious. Andrew Huberman would say he was using urgency and focus to maximize the heightened state of neuroplasticity. Jung was treating isolation not as passive escape, but as an active laboratory of transformation. And here's the complete protocol that ties it all together in a practical and applicable way. First, you need to define a clear intention before entering isolation. Why are you withdrawing? What specifically do you want to confront? What do you hope to integrate at the end? Without a clear and defined intention, its isolation becomes escape disguised as transformation. And you lose the opportunity that heightened state of neuroplasticity offers. Second, you need to structure your time with specific practices. Don't let isolation become a formless vacuum. Have set times for specific practices throughout the day. Meditation in the morning, when the medial prefrontal cortex is most active. Journaling after meditation to capture insights. Active imagination in the afternoon, when the mind is more receptive. Physical exercise to process material through the body. Adequate sleep to consolidate neural changes. Structure prevents you from falling into passive rumination and maintains the active engagement that maximizes plasticity. Third, you need to prepare support for when difficult material arises. This could be a therapist you can contact if needed, a trusted friend who knows what you're doing and can help you process, written resources you can consult when you feel you're losing your way. Jung had his red book, where he documented absolutely everything that emerged. You need some equivalent way of giving concrete form to what emerges from the unconscious. Fourth, you need to actively monitor the signs that isolation is becoming pathological rather than transformative. If after 2 weeks you're more confused instead of clearer, more anxious instead of more centered, more lost instead of more found, more fragmented instead of more integrated, that's a clear sign to adjust something. Maybe shorten the period, maybe seek external support, maybe change the practices you're using. Fifth, you need to plan the return from the beginning of isolation. How will you reintegrate what you discovered into practical social life? What concrete changes do you intend to make in specific relationships? What behavioral patterns do you want to transform? Isolation without a clear plan for return isn't a journey of transformation. It's escape that disguises itself as growth. Sixth, you need to deeply accept that the first days will be intensely uncomfortable. Don't interpret discomfort as failure or a sign that you're doing something wrong. Interpret it as a clear sign that you're stepping outside the neurological comfort zone. That was maintaining the same repetitive patterns. The tension and discomfort are the entry point for real change. Seventh, you need to use the silence for active confrontation, not for passive comfort. If your isolation is becoming just passive peace, without any internal challenge, without any difficult material surfacing, you might be avoiding the real work instead of doing it. Genuine and lasting peace comes after confronting your shadow self, not instead of it. Eighth, you need to practice what Andrew Huberman calls self-directed adaptive plasticity. This means consciously guiding the neural reorganization, instead of letting it happen randomly or chaotically. You do this by intentionally focusing on the specific patterns you want to change and the specific truths you want to integrate. Strategically using your heightened state of neuroplasticity, Jung said that after periods of isolation, confrontation, and even despair, comes the potential for genuine rebirth. This isn't just about temporarily feeling better. It signifies a profound, permanent inner transformation, a psychological and spiritual renewal that changes who you are at a fundamental level. He firmly believed that crises and challenges contain the seeds for profound growth. If they are approached correctly, your brain literally becomes different during well-conducted voluntary isolation. 46 genes change their expression in just 10 days. Connectivity between brain networks progressively reorganizes. The amygdala processes more emotional material than would normally be possible. The medial prefrontal cortex restructures its priorities and processing patterns. The question isn't if you will change during isolation, you will inevitably change. The crucial question is whether you will consciously direct that change, or let it happen chaotically, without direction. Jung mapped the psychological territory over a century ago, using symbolic and poetic language. Modern neuroscience now confirms that he was describing real processes, with measurable and observable consequences in the physical brain. And you can use this combined knowledge from both traditions to transform periods of solitude into powerful catalysts for growth, instead of spirals of deterioration and pathological isolation. Solitude is not an empty absence. It's presence with yourself. What you do with that presence completely determines whether isolation builds you up or destroys you, whether it transforms you or fragments you. In the last few minutes, you've discovered something that most people will never understand in their entire lives. You've seen how voluntary isolation differs neurologically from forced isolation. You've learned the detailed timeline of brain changes day after day. You understand why the first few days are intensely uncomfortable, and why that discomfort is an essential part of the process, not a sign of error or failure. This kind of deep synthesis doesn't exist anywhere else. connecting what Jung discovered a century ago with the neuroimaging studies of 2024 and 2025, showing how the psychological shadow self relates to the physical amygdala, how individuation relates to neural plasticity. This is work that few do, because it requires mastering worlds that academia stubbornly insists on keeping separate. If you're considering a period of voluntary isolation, or if you're in the middle of one right now, this information can make the crucial difference between genuine transformation and progressive deterioration. And if this has helped you understand what's happening with you, consider supporting this work through super thanks. Each time you click the golden heart, you say, continue doing this bridge between deep psychology and neuroscience. Continue revealing what's buried between separate academic disciplines. Continue translating Jung into the language of the brain, and Andrew Huberman into the language of the soul. In the comments, tell me, have you ever gone through a period of voluntary isolation? What did you discover about yourself during that time? How many days did it last? And what changed in you afterward? Or are you planning such a period? And has this information changed how you'll approach the experience? Your experience might be exactly what someone else needed to hear, to understand that the initial discomfort isn't failure. It's the necessary entry point for genuine transformation. Jung isolated himself for 6 years and emerged with the theories that changed psychology forever. Andrew Huberman has scientifically proven that every brain is capable of self-directed adaptive plasticity, and you are living that possibility right now. The only question that remains is, are you going to use the silence to escape from yourself, or to confront who you really are, to escape who you are, or to discover who you can become? Your brain is waiting for your answer, and 46 genes are ready to change when you decide to take the first step.